This first session is the doom and gloom, what happens when things go wrong, because as Gary said, we specialise in the investigation, forensic investigation of fires, first to identify the cause and secondly to deal with reasons for spread. And when it comes to spread, we may ultimately have to resort to determining whether there was compliance with building regulations and guidance in terms of appropriate fire precautions. I'm going to start with a couple of fairly dramatic examples which you may be familiar with. The first is the Joelma building fire in Brazil in 1974, which is a prime example of the way fire can spread up the outside of a building and totally destroy it, with quite a number of fatalities and a number of serious injuries. Secondly, and more recently, a fire that I investigated at Telstar House in Paddington, where Transport for London had their headquarters. And there's some rather interesting photographs captured by the London Fire Brigade as they were dealing with the fire, showing in its early stages significant flame emission from windows, the fire beginning to spread on a particular floor, flame height increasing further, and you can just see now on the floor above that the window blinds are igniting and conveying the fire to the next level. Fire's dying down a little on the floor of origin and are beginning to develop on the next floor. The fire builds up, considerable ventilation, and we get a similar cascade effect, ultimately spreading the fire from the 7th to the 12th floors. Now, fortunately, in social housing, we don't have the same sort of problems as arose in those commercial buildings where there is no compartmentation, open plan office arrangement, plenty of ventilation on both sides of the building, so if there's a wind and the windows break, the fire is well ventilated and it can develop in the way that we saw. Now, I'm not a specialist on building regulations and authoritative guidance, but during the course of our investigations, we inevitably have to refer to the appropriate documents to make an assessment of whether any features of fire spread that we've observed are potential breaches of guidance and regulation. There are many of you here who are using these documents in anger on a daily basis and are far more skilled at that than I am, but I just list some examples of those that we refer to quite routinely. And more recently, of course, the regulatory reform fire safety order is a milestone, I think, in legislation, particularly because as far as local authorities are concerned, it places a duty on the responsible person to take general fire precautions to ensure that as far as is reasonably practicable, the safety of the people on the premises and in the immediate vicinity of the premises is catered for. The regulations and guidance will be concerned with a number of 4 key areas. Again, you're all familiar with these, and so I don't dwell on these at any length. More particularly from our point of view, the guidance and the regulations are concerned with structural fire precautions aimed at, of course, ensuring safe means of escape in a prescribed period of time by prescribed routes, and also the avoidance of any risk of compromising those means of escape by deficiencies in other fire precaution measures, such as making sure that ducts that are in common areas are properly protected. And now I'm going to give you just a few case studies with examples, and this is not exhaustive, a few examples of the ways in which we have found fire spread in social housing. The problems with these fire spread mechanisms are encountered less with modern buildings than those which are being updated under the Decent Homes Initiative. For obvious reasons, retrofit installations in properties introduce potentially new areas of a problem, and it is in these areas that we are finding more cases of fires actually seeking out these deficiencies. The first case I'm going to deal with is the Harrow Court fire, which sadly claimed the lives of 2 fire officers and an occupant of one of the flats. The first occupant had been rescued. And this is an example of fire spread up the outside of the building. Those of you who are familiar with the case will know that the fire started at a fairly high level in the lounge of the building, of the flat Arrowed. Firefighters reached this area fairly quickly and had trouble actually getting connections to a riser to charge the hose, even though they'd taken the hose into the flat of interest. That's the common corridor at the appropriate level, and although it is heavily smoke damaged and to a limited extent heat damaged, it has suffered remarkably little by comparison with the gutted flat which communicated onto this common area. And the only reason that it is damaged to this degree is because unfortunately the hose had been taken in through the door to the flat, and the door didn't close completely during the course of the fire. And as we look into the entrance corridor, you can see that this is completely gutted, and the area where the fire started, which is the lounge, was completely destroyed. And not surprisingly, a fully developed fire in this compartment produced sufficient venting of flame to escape and impinge on the windows of the flat above. And if we go through the entrance door to this flat, we can see that the entrance passageway is damaged to a lesser degree, but nevertheless quite serious. The entrance door has clearly stood up well. It's been broken in by the fire brigade. And beyond that, the lounge immediately above the one where the fire started is also very seriously damaged. This slide is one that highlights a rather unusual mechanism of secondary fire development that we've encountered in high-rise buildings. When a lot of water is used at higher levels, it flows down, cascades down to lower levels, and it spreads into compartments where the electricity service equipment is located. And naturally, as you would expect, when that gets wet, there's a potential to flash over between the live and neutral supply. That can eject molten globules, which in turn can start secondary fires if there is combustible material in the cupboards. And this was initially looked at as a potential deliberate second seat of fire. But once we looked at it in more detail, this was the logical explanation, and we found a number of near misses in other compartments.